Welcome to this tutorial on influence diagrams. This is one of a series of tutorials on approaches, methods and tools to assist you in your systems thinking and practice. Let's first look at the function of influence diagrams, or what it is that they do. So influence diagrams represent how elements of a situation influence each other. They're created from a particular perspective and for a particular context. They do not represent causation and do not show sequence or flow of events or activities, even though sometimes it might appear that they do. Let's move on to the purpose of influence diagrams, or what it is that they help you to do. First of all, they help to develop an understanding of a problem situation or opportunity. They can help to map systemic influence revealed in your research and practice. They may also inform or be informed by other diagramming approaches such as multiple cause diagrams, causal loop diagrams, or actor maps. They may also be combined with other approaches such as axiomaps. Typically, these are constructed in a group setting, although they may also be used by individuals in systems diagramming. Let me start with an example now to build an influence diagram to help understand it in context. And here I'm going to talk about reporting behavior, in particular incident reporting behavior in a safety critical context. So here we have reporting behavior, which is a thing that we really want to influence. And here I've put it at the bottom of the diagram, but there's no particular need to do that. It could even be in the center of the diagram or really anywhere else. I've started to think about what it is that influences reporting behavior. And here I've gone back to some psychology research on behavior change. Specifically in this context is from health psychology, and we know that the capability is a key influence on behavior. So somebody has to be capable of behaving in a certain way, physically and also psychologically. There also has to be opportunity. So in this case, the opportunity to report. There has to be a means by which people can report, and there has to be the time available, the facilities available, and so on. So that's the second factor that I'm going to put on this influence diagram. And then we have the motivation to report. So even if there's the capability to report and there's the opportunity to report, people also have to be motivated to report. They have to want to report and not see it as being something that's going to bring them perhaps unwanted consequences if they do so. Now, these three factors are from the HUM-SYS-V model by Susan Michie and her colleagues. And so this particular root model of this diagram is well founded in the research, but typically with influence diagrams you can start at any place. There's no particular need to start with any established model. In this case it's quite helpful. So let's now move to the capability to report. So we know that knowledge of reporting requirements will influence capability to report, because people have to know what they should report, how they should report it, when they should report, to whom, by what means, and so on. So that's quite fundamental. We also know from research and from practice that previous experience is going to have a large influence on reporting behavior throughout. In this case, previous experience of reporting will affect or influence the knowledge of reporting requirements. Let's just move now to the opportunity to report. So do people actually have the opportunity to report? And time available will be a critical factor. Again, we know that from research and from practice. If you want people to be able to report unwanted events, then they need the time to do so. Time available will be influenced by the work situation. So the workload that people have will influence their time available to do things like submit reports. And if people are expected to submit reports when they're on their break, for instance, or during their lunch, then the chances of reporting may be lower. Opportunity to report is also influenced by the ease of reporting. So you need access to reporting facilities, for instance. Maybe that's a computer, or that might be paper-based reporting, or it might be in person to a supervisor, for instance. And then the design of those systems will influence the ease of that reporting. So we're starting to build up an influence map showing that the capability and the opportunity to report are influenced by a range of other factors. Now we can see that the company policy and system will influence the design of the reporting system. So we're going right up to, let's say, the top level of the company in terms of policy and system design. And that company policy and this design of systems, which might be safety management systems, quality management systems, for example, will be influenced by regulatory requirements, which are external to the organization but have an influence on it. Now, previous experience, which we already highlighted, will also influence the ease of reporting. Again, through repeated experience, things tend to become easier. So once you've used a reporting system once, for instance, then you'll know how to use it the next time, and it will become easier with practice and with experience. That ease of reporting will also influence the motivation to report. A reporting system that's easy to use is obviously more user-friendly, and that will be more motivating for people to actually decide to use. Now, turning to the motivation for a moment now, a range of factors will influence the motivation to report, and one of those will be the perception of personal consequences. So what will happen to me if I do report an incident or other unwanted event? Now, how I perceive those consequences will influence my motivation greatly. And that might be different to the actual consequences. What matters is how I actually perceive them. And that perception will be influenced also by the seriousness of the incident or other unwanted event. Typically, with more serious incidents, we may fear more consequences for ourselves, even if that is not fair or just. Perception of consequences will also be influenced, of course, by previous experience. If we've experienced negative consequences, unfair consequences in particular, in the past, then we may be less likely to want to report, or we may be motivated to report things in a certain way, perhaps not disclosing everything that happened, or disclosing it in a different way to how it actually happened. Perception of consequences for oneself will also be influenced by company policy and systems. Maybe, for instance, an organization has a just culture policy, which is well established in the culture, supported by management, and so on. In that case, my perception of personal consequences might be different to if there is no such company policy. Another factor influencing motivation is perception of confidentiality. Now, our motivation to report will be influenced by our thoughts and feelings about being identified. Typically, when an incident or unwanted event is reported, we do submit our details, so our identity is known, but only to a few people. Typically, those who are actually analysing, investigating the report. If I think that my details will be leaked or spread more widely, then I will perceive confidentiality negatively, and that may influence my motivation to report. That perception of confidentiality will also be influenced by company policy and systems, because perhaps within the company policy, within the safety management systems and the other systems available, there are particular provisions for confidentiality. Previous experience, again, will be influential here, just as it was with perception of personal consequences. If we've experienced in the past that our confidentiality has been breached, then that's going to affect our perception. Another factor that we know from research and practice is very strongly influences the motivation to report is expectation of feedback. This is very often one of the top 3 factors influencing motivation. So if we submit some kind of report, then do we expect that we will get personal feedback? When do we think we will get it, and what kind of feedback do we think we will get? Will it be useful to us? Will it signal some kind of perhaps change to how the company is run and organized? All of these kinds of factors will influence our expectation of feedback, which will influence our motivation. And that expectation of feedback will again be influenced by company policy and systems, because again, perhaps there are provisions or requirements that people are given feedback following their reports. Previous experience, again, will also influence that expectation. If we've had good feedback in the past, then we may be more motivated to report. If, on the other hand, we've made reports but had no feedback, our motivation may be affected in the other direction. Another factor that we know from research and practice influences reporting behavior, especially motivation, is company-level learning and change following reporting. So when something is reported, what happens at a company level? Let's say there's a problem with technology or with procedures or with staffing or the way that work is organized. Are there changes following reports on these matters, or does nothing particular happen? Or perhaps something happens, but it's not communicated. All of these factors will again influence motivation to report. This is also again influenced by company policy and systems, because somehow learning at a company level may well be covered within the company policy, perhaps in terms of communication. Now, the company level learning and change will influence also expectation of feedback, because the change in itself is a kind of feedback to individuals. And now we have a new influence, which is peer group values, attitudes and behaviours, which we might loosely call the local culture. Now we know that these have a very strong influence on individual behaviour, because we all want to somehow fit in with our peer group. We don't want to be excluded, we don't want to be the outsider. And so how our peers value reporting, what their attitudes are to it, and what their practices are, including how we talk about it, that will influence our motivation to report. And that also will be influenced by company level learning and change following reporting. If there's very little change on a systemic level following reporting, then peers may well say it's not worth doing. Seriousness of an incident may also influence the peer group values, attitudes and practices, and that could happen in different directions. But perhaps for a more serious incident where it's more obvious internally and perhaps externally to the organisation, it could be that the peer group say this must be reported, whereas for minor things that happen repeatedly, perhaps the peer group say it's not worth it. Could it even happen in the opposite direction? Those peer group values, attitudes and practices will also influence our perception of personal consequences. Not just our own previous experience, but the previous experience of our peers. There will also be an influence on perception of confidentiality through what we hear about confidentiality from our peers, and also expectation of feedback. What do our peers say about the likelihood of and usefulness of feedback following reporting? And then we have management attitudes and behaviour, which will influence motivation to report. So how do managers behave, and what is their attitudes? We will observe these through what they say and what they do, and that will influence motivation to report. It will also influence perception of personal consequences through what managers say and what they do. And it will influence the peer group, of course, and it will also influence our experience, what's happened to us in the past, how have managers reacted. Peer group values, attitudes and practices will now also influence managers' attitudes and behaviour. So there's a kind of feedback loop there going on. The seriousness of the incident is another factor that will tend to influence how managers behave and their attitudes. Typically, more serious incidents will be viewed more seriously, and so that will affect the pressure that perhaps managers exert to report. And managers' attitudes, behaviour are affected by the company level learning and change. If managers recognise that there is positive change within the company following reporting, then they're more likely, of course, to reinforce it. And again, there's a feedback loop going in both directions, because how managers act will also be a key influence on learning and change within the organisation. Company policy and systems will also have an influence on management attitudes and behaviours. It may be more or less strong. And again, another feedback loop, because managers' attitudes and behaviour will affect company policy and systems, especially if they are involved in adapting or writing or, of course, enacting those policies and systems. And the management attitudes and behaviour will now influence perception of confidentiality, again, along with many other influences. And so we start to see that there are more and more feedback loops going on within this influence diagram. Here you can see that there are some particularly problematic elements of a particular situation. So this is just an example, a typical situation where motivation to report is influenced primarily by these elements in red. Here we can see that management attitudes and behaviour are particularly influential in this scenario. What we can see through the thick lines there, the thick arrows, are strong influences on, for instance, peer groups, on perception of personal consequences, on motivation to report. We can also see that the seriousness of an incident is affecting management attitudes and behaviour, and also perception of personal consequences. Even though the seriousness of an incident doesn't necessarily tell us much about the different kinds of practices and behaviours, that could be due to all manner of other factors. And so somehow what we want to do is influence management attitudes and behaviour in this particular scenario. And so I've highlighted here some other factors that might be able to be strengthened in terms of influence. One of those is company level learning and change following reporting. So if there's positive change that's done with people, incorporating group discussions, for instance, to understand what goes on during serious incidents and during non-serious incidents, and also during everyday work, that might have an influence on managers, particularly if they can see that changes can be made that influence safety in a positive way and also influence other goals in a positive way. Company policy and systems could also be a stronger link on management attitudes and behaviours, perhaps through strengthening the communication of those policies and those systems. There could be some other positive influences at this stage that could be designed, and one of those could be, for instance, education and coaching. Now, if we have a strong link from education and coaching to management attitudes and behaviours, then that might have a good influence. And that education and coaching will need a strong influence from company policy and systems so that it's well implemented. Here's now another example where we have a problem with expectation of feedback, which, as I said earlier, is not uncommon. Now, in this case, the expectation of feedback is strongly influenced by peer groups, by company level learning and change, and by previous experience. That's where the particularly strong links are. And we also have some strong link going from company policy to company level learning and change, from company level learning and change through to peer groups and all the way down to motivation to report. Again, we can remove the other factors for clarity of this particular diagram just to look at what's going on here. And we can again see the strong influences more clearly and perhaps the influences that need to be stronger. So here again we can see some influences that perhaps we need to strengthen. The influence of company policy and systems on expectation of feedback and also on company level learning and change following reporting. And the influence of that company level learning and change on peer groups. Now we can influence company level learning and change and we can influence company policy and systems. It's quite hard directly to influence peer group values, attitudes and practices, only indirectly through what they actually observe and experience. So that gives us some areas of focus where we might want to look at to improve expectation of feedback. Let's finally move on now to some tips for influence diagramming. So typically you'll get together as a group to do some influence diagramming, and that could be a small group of 2 or 3 or a group up to about 6 or 7, perhaps more, but it gets more difficult. But when you're doing this, whether you're doing this on your own as a practitioner or as a group, you may start with a system map, which is covered in another tutorial. It could also be independent of a system map. And while it's very common to create an influence diagram from a system map, it's not always the best place to start. For this particular influence diagram that you've just seen, that was created from scratch. Now they're normally drawn without a predefined structure or levels, which can be quite difficult for people to make a start. But you can use some kind of structure if you prefer. For instance, an influence diagram such as the one that you've seen can be overlaid onto the levels of an axiomap. On an axiomap we have various different levels from the kind of the work situation through to local management, through to senior management, through to regulators, through to government, and so on. And so you can rearrange your influence diagram on an axiomap. Now the thickness of arrows, as I mentioned, often indicates the degree or strength of influence, and arrows may be labelled if it's not clear the nature of influence or if you want to make it clear. You can also add some kind of coding, such as colour coding, as you saw earlier. Now bidirectional arrows are usually avoided unless each node of the arrow has exactly the same influence, even though that's quite difficult to measure, but at least the same sort of influence. So usually you will use 2 separate arrows. That then gives you an idea of actually some feedback loops that are going on in your influence diagram. In that case, you can start to use some other methods by taking those particular aspects of the situation and looking at, for instance, the causal loops. So you could do some causal loop diagramming based on specific aspects of your influence diagram. You may also want to consider the distance between the influences, although this can be quite difficult unless you're doing it on a large sheet of paper or whiteboard, for instance. So, for instance, you wouldn't want regulatory decisions to be perhaps immediately next to frontline operator decisions. You might want some physical distance on your influence map to show that they are more distal influences. Now for the case study, you can consult the research on the screen if you wish, and that case study came from lots of different research around Europe and also a lot of practice in many different countries. And so you can download those and you can see the short URLs on some of those papers. And you might also be interested to download the safety culture discussion cards from Skybrary, and you can also see the short URL at the bottom of the screen there. And this is a set of 80 or so cards that were developed from a safety culture work, and one section of the cards, as you can see, is about reporting and investigation. And so you can actually use some of these cards to do or to inform an influence map when it comes to reporting, for instance, or any other aspect of safety indicated on these cards. So they might just be an assistance in understanding some of the influences. These are available at the moment in English, but they'll also available in other languages over the next few weeks on Skybrary. So just keep an eye on that for various European languages. And finally, you might be interested in Hindsight magazine, which is a magazine on human and organizational factors in operations. We're currently up to number 31, and number 32 will be out in this summer of 2021. And as you can see, there's a range of issues there going back, looking at human and organizational factors in operations, relevant not only to aviation but also to other sectors. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope it's useful for your systems thinking and practice, and look out for the others available on other methods. Bye for now.